Hi there, Year 10. Welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast, and we're talking to you today about the poem When We Two Parted by Lord Byron. With you today you have Miss Beaumont,
Mr. Rafi,
and Mr. Amos.
Before you listen to the rest of this podcast, it's important that you've read the poem When We Two Parted, so if you need to pause the podcast now to do that, please go ahead, but otherwise let's get started. So I thought we'd start today by talking a little bit about what we think the poem is about, and also a bit about Lord Byron as well, to help us understand the context of the poem, and to help us to understand perhaps why he might have written it in a little bit more detail. So first of all, it's clearly a breakup poem, isn't it? When We Two Parted, it's really obvious from the title. What are some of the feelings that are present, would you say, in the poem, Mr. Rafi or Mr. Amar?
a feeling of perhaps regret, also a feeling of bitterness towards perhaps the other party that's potentially being deceitful. He used the word deceive a couple of times, I think. So we see this sort of unintentional breakup or something that's happened between them that's not definitely not through his choice or through his actions, but by the looks of it.
I'd agree. I think there's a real mixture of quite sorrowful imagery, but also quite angry lines as well. And that really fits in with Lord Byron's life. So to give you a little bit of context about him, one of his contemporaries described him as mad, bad and dangerous to know. Lord Byron was almost like the first ever celebrity. If you can imagine somebody who would be constantly in the tabloid news, constantly being talked about and gossiped about, because the life that he led was really quite scandalous. He was well known for having lots of affairs, often with married people, both men and women, and obviously that would lead to him being the subject of gossip an awful lot amongst the high society that he was a part of. He's called Lord Byron because he was a lord. He was a member of the aristocracy. So everybody would have known Lord Byron's name, and everybody would have talked about the many romantic liaisons that he was rumoured to be taking part in. So that means that this poem really would have been seen at the time as quite a mysterious poem, and people would have wondered, who is it that he's talking about in this poem? We don't have many clues. We don't know whether he's talking about a man or a woman. We don't know whether he's talking about somebody who is married. All we know is that it's a secret relationship. So there would have been lots of speculation about perhaps the nature of that relationship at the time that people would have really taken delight in. So looking at the language in the poem, we've already said there's lots of feelings of sorrow and anger and bitterness. Does anything stand out to anyone in terms of the language that's been used that helps to demonstrate any of those feelings?
I would definitely say in the first stanza, line 3, where you can see the quote, half broken hearted, it can suggest a variety of things. Firstly, it could highlight that his emotions are quite mixed. So he hasn't fully broken his heart, but he's maybe being cracked with the thought of realizing that it's not going to continue. But he's also maybe doesn't come to the realization that it's completely finished. So he might have idolized the relationship too much, and he hasn't come to terms that it's not going to work. So instead of being completely heartbroken, he's half, because he hasn't mentally accepted that it's not going to be fixed. And that is evidenced by his constant reference to the relationship and not leaving his mind. I'd also say, biologically speaking, you cannot be half broken, which means that maybe physically he's not the same man anymore. He's maybe a shell of his former self, and he's lost the emotions that the heart is associated to, so happiness, joy, and life. And he maybe doesn't feel like at this point that life is as great as we all know it can be.
I definitely agree, and I think the use of the imagery of death to describe this death of the relationship really fits in with that idea of being half broken-hearted. Physically, he describes in the first stanza how her kiss grew colder. So emotionally, that implies that perhaps she was drawing away from him, or he was drawing away from him, and this person, the end of the relationship, it was clear to him that it was going to end. And that really ties into the theme and the idea that he can't move past this and can't move on from it. I can see there's a semantic field of death within the poem, so there's lots of references to, for example, the adjective pale, which implies somebody has grown white as you do in death. Obviously cold as well, when you die you grow cold. We've got a reference to a knell in the third stanza, and a knell is a bell that's rung traditionally at funerals. So we've almost got this idea that every time he hears her, it's like a part of him has died, metaphorically, and perhaps symbolically as well. Something else I think is really interesting is the use of sibilance in the poem. So remember, sibilance is that repeated S sound, and we've got lots of words that really make use of that. In secret we met, in silence I grieve. And for me, that makes me think of a whispered kind of hush sound, which really exemplifies how the sense of secrecy and mystery within the poem has been brought to the fore. In terms of structure, there's quite a lot of repetition, isn't there, in the poem? What might that suggest about Byron or the speaker in the poem and how they feel about that relationship?
We'll see this constant theme of perhaps obsession or perhaps one-sided love or one-sided sort of relationship that he, for whatever reason, can't move on. So a lot of the themes or a lot of the words and phrases that he uses are repeated throughout. There's a cyclical structure in that it starts and ends with silence and tears. Going along with this depressing and or at the same time bitter tone that he just can't move on from what he's feeling. He's sort of stuck obsessing over this, similar to what Mr. was saying with regards to the half-broken hearted with a mixed emotion. I'm guessing he's stuck where he is and he can't move forward from there.
I think that's highlighted with these questions as well. He directly addresses his ex-lover and asks questions like, why wert thou so dear? Or why were you so dear to me? And how should I greet thee at the end of the poem? So it's almost like he's reaching out for that connection again. He wants to be able to have that dialogue with his ex-lover. So again, that just really exemplifies what you were just saying, Mr. Rafi, about the fact that he's still clinging on to this relationship as much as he can. So we've obviously talked a bit about the symbolism of the death knell and how death has been used throughout the poem. In terms of critics, obviously we want to link where we can to the idea of the ladder of love, because we know that links really well to all of the poems in the love and relationships cluster. So where would you put this poem on the ladder of love, Mr. Amar or Mr. Rafi?
I would definitely say it's not a clear fit on either term of the ladder. I would definitely say that it's quite based on Byron's past that he can make a reasonable guess that it fits more with Eros. There's a lot of perhaps sexual tension based on the fact that his backstory, his previous relationship being so secret and so scandalous that you can feel like he's almost imparting his emotions in physical writing. So there's definitely an underlying of Eros. And I also say mania as well, because it's very, very evident that this particular person is obsessed with another, and each stanza is just a continuation of that obsession and growing, and it really creates the idea that how long has this obsession been brewing, that it finally came in fruition in the form of a poem. So it really is quite scary how obsessed this character possibly could be. Alongside that theme of obsession, we can also link that to Sigmund Freud and id, the conscious part of your mind that's linked to desire. So we can clearly make an assumption that this narrator's whole desire, his whole maybe even ethos or understanding of what he wants is just particularly around this person. We don't see anything else mentioned in this poem. There's nothing about any extrinsic motivation or nothing about any aspirations in life. From the beginning of this poem, like Mr. Arfi said earlier on, it's cyclical structure. So this cycle of obsession is just continuing and continuing and continuing, ending with his negative emotions in silence and tears.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the fact that he's clearly pursued this relationship without thinking about the consequences of it beforehand, that links in really strongly with what you were saying about him being ruled by his id as well. He doesn't have his superego, which perhaps would have moderated him pursuing a relationship with presumably a married or otherwise unavailable person. So the fact that he has done that would very strongly suggest that he's been ruled by his id rather than his ego or his superego. So we've obviously got lots of themes here in this poem. We've got obsession, we've got unrequited love, which is love that is not returned by somebody else. We've got the theme of heartache and isolation. So are there any other poems that would be strong links to this one thematically that anybody can think of that might be good to use in an exam-style question?
With regards to the obsession, we can have a look at Porphyria's Lover. Also with regards to the unrequited love, or so seemingly, we can see that the poet or the speaker comes across as someone who's who's really sort of forceful in the way that they're loving or presenting their emotions towards the other party. Obviously, in one case it gets very physical. In this case, it's very sort of emotional and mental, sort of a thought process that he's clutching onto for a long, long time, so it seems. But in Porphyria's Lover, it actually turns and he gets from a thought process and feelings to something physical, and he acts upon his obsessive and controlling feelings.
Yeah, I'll also make a link to Farmer's Bride, clear references to obsession and also unattainability in both poems. In the case of Farmer's Bride, actually being married, but not actually having the same love required, it's being unrequited love, and the negative connotation of not being able to accept that you're not being loved is very similar to what's been shown in this poem. Not being able to have the relationship and the emotions that are brought forward with not being able to attain what you desire.
Yeah, and similarly, love's